welcome to our cell structure test review. I'm Mrs. Olson, and I'm going to take a couple minutes and go through your 5 objectives for this unit. Objective number 1, you should be able to look and label the parts of the cell, including cell wall, cell membrane, nucleus, chloroplast, and cytoplasm, whether it's a plant or an animal cell. You should also be able to handle and use a microscope properly. So let's start with a microscope. To handle or to move it, 2 hands, carry it carefully like a little baby. Always start on low power and work higher from there. And it is a tool that we use to observe things that are smaller. Now we're limited in that we have just a compound light microscope, and it is one that is not as powerful as others, but it gets our job done. So let's look at the different parts of the cell that you need to be able to label. Specifically, the cell membrane, which is the outermost of an animal cell, or just inside a cell wall in a plant cell. Speaking of cell wall, the outermost rigid layer found in a plant cell, but not found in an animal cell. So don't let me trick you. If I ask you to label the cell wall in an animal cell, you better tell me you can't do it or it doesn't exist. The nucleus is typically in the center, typically ball-shaped. It is, well, the artist can color it any color they want, but there's one in most cells. The cytoplasm is kind of like the stuff in between. So it's, or you would label it where you can't see any other specific organelles, but inside the cell membrane. So it is the space filler. Let's take a minute and go or explain the difference between plant and animal cells. A plant cell has a cell wall and has a chloroplast. An animal cell does not. Everything else is basically the same. Obviously, different cells have different functions, so they'll have different organelles or different numbers of organelles. But we're looking at those as the 2 main differences. So plant cells have a cell wall and have a chloroplast. Both of these are eukaryotic cells. Let's actually get to that word. So your second objective is to be able to tell the difference or tell whether a cell is prokaryotic or eukaryotic, and to tell the difference between a plant cell and an animal cell. So we just took a little bit of time going through plant cells and animal cells. But let's start with prokaryote versus eukaryote, and then we'll come back to it. So things that you can tell between the nucleus and the size and the complexity. So pro means before a true nucleus. So pro is the one that does not have a nucleus, that it is usually smaller in size, and it is usually less complex. So maybe you can think of pro means no, or some other memory trick to help you remember that prokaryote, no nucleus, smaller in size, less complex. Eukaryotic cells are the kind of cells that you have in your body. So eukaryotic cells are typically larger. They do have a true nucleus, or their DNA and genetic material is bound inside of membrane, and they are typically more complex in what they have. So let's look at a few pictures, because one of your essential objectives, and for this one for your test, is I need to show you a picture, and you need to be able to tell me whether it's a prokaryote or eukaryote. So let's look at this one. Ask yourself, simple, complex. Size doesn't really help since you have nothing to compare. Do you see a nucleus? So I look at this, there's no nucleus, and it looks fairly simple inside. So that is a prokaryote, bacteria to be specific, prokaryote. Let's look at this one. Ask yourself, simple or complex? Do you see a nucleus? Actually, let's focus on nucleus or no nucleus. So let's go back to that other one. Once again, no nucleus, so prokaryote. Now back to this one. There is a nucleus. It's in the center. It is a eukaryote. Let's look at this last one. Do you see a nucleus? No. So it has to be a prokaryote. If you are still iffy on those, come see me, because that's a pretty basic skill that we'd want to give you more practice on. Let's go back to plant versus animal. Remember, both have a nucleus, both plant cells and animal cells. They're both eukaryotic. Remember, eukaryotic has a nucleus. They both have a cell membrane, so plant cells have a cell membrane and animal cells have a cell membrane. Only a plant cell has a cell wall, and only a plant cell has chloroplasts. That's where photosynthesis is occurring. So what you would want to do is look at pictures and look for cell walls, look for chloroplasts. You can also look for color. In general, animal cells are green. Not always, but that could be a clue. You can also look for shape. In general, plant cells are rectangular or have sharp edges, while animal cells are usually round or more smooth edges. So let's look at this. There are 2 pictures. One of them is a plant cell, one of those is an animal cell. So look at them, decide which one has a cell wall, which one has chloroplasts. Try and figure out which is which. The one on the left, the round one, is an animal cell. The rectangular one on the right is a plant cell. Let's try this one. Is it a plant or an animal cell? Now they're not labeled, but they're numbered. I can see sharp corners. I can see something green. It looks like a green jelly bean. I can see a large sack of water. So let's label those. So C is the chloroplast, E is the vacuole filled with water, and A is the cell wall. So based on that, that must be a plant cell. And last one. Take a look. Take a guess. It's going to be an animal cell. It is round. I don't see a cell wall. I do see a number of complex organelles, but we would call that an animal cell. So objective number 3 is to understand the functions of a lot of those organelles. So function is, what is its job? What's the purpose? Why does the cell have it? So let's go back to some of the cell parts we already talked about and added a few more. There are those 5 for objective number 1 that you have to be able to label. But these you need to be able to tell me, what do they do? So the cell membrane, some things about it, it's flexible. It's the outermost layer in an animal cell. It determines what goes in and out of a cell. So it's kind of like a doorway. If we were to compare this cell to American Fork Junior High, the cell membrane would be the doors that you open and shut to let things in and out, even though they're not flexible, but the jobs match. Cell wall, on the other hand, is hard and rigid. You find them in plant cells and some other kinds of cells. It's used to support and protect. So we would call it like the walls of the school. So cell wall, walls of school. Cell membrane, doorway of school. The nucleus is the control center for the cell. It's kind of like a brain. It holds the DNA. So we would say the nucleus would be like the front office and all of the principals, because they kind of run the school. Next up we have the cytoplasm. It's a matrix that has tubes throughout, that its job is to help move things around the cell and to help keep the cell's shape or to fill up the space that's not occupied by other organelles. So if you were to eat Jell-O with fruit in it, the cytoplasm would be like the Jell-O, and then the fruit would be like all of the organelles. So if we were to continue the analogy to the school, the cytoplasm would be like the hallways of the school. Helps things move around, kind of helps keep the shape. That's the purpose of the cytoplasm. The lysosome acts or has digestive enzymes. It's kind of like the garbage disposal of the cell. It breaks things down. Now, when I think of lysosome, I think of the cleaner Lysol, and I think, oh, lysosomes clean things up. It's the garbage. It's the, in our school analogy, our custodians, our janitors. That's how I remember lysosome. Mitochondria makes the energy from the cells. The food that the cell gets, it breaks it down into a form that can be more easily used. There are lots of folds and a lot of surface area inside of mitochondria. It's kind of like a power plant. So it's, well, a couple ways. Back to our school example, I would say the mitochondria is, well, the generator. Let's call it the generator. It's where we get all the energy. I also like to think of Mighty Mouse, which is a really old cartoon. It was even older and before my time. But I think Mighty, because he would be really fast and have a lot of energy. So I think mitochondria, Mighty Mouse. He gets to share and run and fast and be very energetic. Last but not least, our chloroplast. We only find in plant cells or in autotrophs. Don't worry about that word yet. It basically is the organelle that can change sunlight into sugar. It typically is green. They kind of look like green jelly beans. It's also like a power plant. So if the school was a plant, then we would say that the generator is also like a chloroplast. So mitochondria and chloroplast both produce energy. Chloroplast uses sunlight to do it. Mitochondria breaks down sugar. So objective number 4 is to show and explain how diffusion and osmosis work in a cell and how they are changing with the motion of particles and how concentration values come into play. So first, let's review. Diffusion is when the particles are spreading out, like spraying perfume. It starts very concentrated at the point of the spray and eventually will spread out so that it's throughout the room. Osmosis is a kind of diffusion, but this is where water is passing through a membrane. So there are 2 keys or 2 characteristics that must be met to make it osmosis. It has to be water that's doing the moving, and it has to be going through a cell membrane. So motion of particles, there's no energy needed. It's kind of like a rock rolling down a hill. So diffusion and osmosis happen naturally without the cell having to input energy to make it happen. Both have the point or the purpose of trying to balance the concentration of materials. So things will flow from where there's a lot to where there's a little, or from a high concentration to a low concentration. Other diffusion examples, think when we dropped a drop of food coloring in a beaker of water, or when you put your gummy bear into a liquid and the liquids tried to balance on either side. Those are all diffusion. Osmosis, again, has to be water and through a membrane. So if you are, well, actually, let's look at some examples. I have a series of scenarios. Your job is to decide whether it's diffusion or osmosis. So diffusion is they're just spreading out. Osmosis has to be water through a membrane. So which is it? Spraying perfume in a room? Diffusion. Pulling water out of a worm by putting salt on it? It's mean, by the way, don't do it. Osmosis, because a worm is alive and made of cells, and it's water that's doing the moving. Water molecules moving into a cell. Osmosis, water, and it's in a cell. Mixing some sugar into Kool-Aid. Diffusion, it's just spreading out. And water going into the root of a plant. Osmosis, water going into a cell. So the net movement, or the overall movement, is to even things out. That's the goal. We want to balance however much water or stuff there is on either side. So let's look at a scenario with some numbers. If I had a cell that's 80% water, and I put it in a solution that's 40% water, which way will the net movement of the water go? So now remember, our goal is to balance. So picture in your mind you have a scale, 80% on one side, 40% on the other. If I want to make those two numbers the same, I have to take some of the 80 and add some to the 40. That means that the cell that's 80% of the water, I'm going to take some of that water, or the cell is going to lose water. So the net movement will be the cell losing water, or the water is getting out of the cell. Objective number 5. Here's where we need to look at the basic functions that are carried within cells that help the organism as a whole. So we're looking at specific things like extracting energy, removing waste, and producing their own food, like metabolism. So let's look at waste removal. This is a pretty basic life function. Some ways a cell can get rid of waste is just by diffusing out of the cell membrane. So carbon dioxide is a waste product that your cells produce, that your cells will actually not have to push out. It just leaves through the cell membrane and goes through the blood and eventually out of your body when you exhale or breathe out. Larger particles are broken down by the lysosome, and then they're released out of the cell. Remember, we said lysosome, Lysol like the cleaner. They're our garbage truck, or their job is to break things down. After the cell releases that waste, the body systems pick it up and help remove it from the organism as a whole, like your urinary system, or again, your respiratory system when you breathe it out. Energy is also a basic life function. The mitochondria and the chloroplasts make energy for the cell, and then the rest of the body can use that as well. For example, the sugar from your lunch is turned into energy by the mitochondria. So it goes through a process so that it can be used by the rest of your body. Or in the daytime or in the summertime when we have a lot of light, the light will hit the plant, and the plant will, with the help of its chloroplasts, convert that sunlight energy into a different form of energy that can be used more easily. It's a complicated process, but that's the basic idea. Bottom line is, things need energy, so there has to be a way to get it. Well, there you go. There is essentially our cell structure unit. Those are the 5 goals that you need to know for our test. Thank you and good luck.